A black woman was just waiting for her flight like everyone else when a cop singled her out, humiliated her at the gate, and accused her without cause. But just 6 minutes later, he's suspended on the spot, and everything about who she is blows up the room. This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about what happens when quiet power meets unchecked authority. Stay with me, because this is the kind of justice you don't see every day. And before we start the story, drop a comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe in dignity for all. It begins, as these things often do, in a place so ordinary it dares you to believe that anything cruel could occur there. A gate at LaGuardia Airport. Early morning. The air still tastes like coffee and ambition. There she sat, Evelyn Daniels, calm, composed, legs crossed with the precision of someone who'd long learned how to make herself both seen and unseen at will. A black woman, alone, in a charcoal pantsuit that whispered authority but made no noise doing it. She was not looking to be noticed. But that is never really our choice, is it? The terminal buzzed with its usual rhythm. Families juggled strollers and boarding passes. Businessmen barked into Bluetooths. Teenagers clung to phone screens like life preservers. And woven through it all was that quiet, chilling hum of suspicion. The kind that black folks in America know too well. The kind that does not shout, but lingers, waiting for the smallest excuse to show its teeth. It starts slow, always slow. The officer didn't approach Evelyn right away. He circled, like doubt, like shame. He stood too long in one spot, scanned too intently. Watched the way her hands moved, too still. Watched the way she read, too focused. Watching the way her presence disrupted nothing, but still seemed to threaten everything. You see, racism at the gate doesn't always call you names. It doesn't need to. It studies you. It anticipates the script it wants you to fulfill. This officer, Officer Bradley, had his script ready. But Evelyn wasn't here to perform. It escalated in whispers. He checked boarding passes of some people, ignored others. But when he reached her, he didn't ask. He commanded, "Ma'am, let me see your boarding pass." His tone wore no uniform, but you could hear the weight of history in it. Not law, but entitlement. Evelyn looked up, slow, calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice carried years. Years of learning how to be careful. How to not become a headline. How to exist in white spaces with dignity intact. But even now, 2025, suit pressed, credentials tucked neatly inside her leather tote, the world still asked her to prove she belonged. Now, if you're over 65 and American, you've seen things. You remember fire hoses and buses, segregated counters, and Sunday sermons turned battlegrounds. But what they don't always tell you is that racism didn't die, it evolved. It went from the front of the bus to the airport gate. From shouting across the street to smiling while doubting your ID. You see, injustice doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a badge. Sometimes it sips coffee just a few seats away from you. And sometimes it looks the woman dead in the eyes. A woman with power she hasn't yet revealed. And dares her to flinch. But Evelyn Daniels did not flinch. She gave him the boarding pass. He examined it too long, too suspiciously. Searched for guilt in her flight number as if it might confess something she had not. Cutting it a little close to boarding, aren't you? Now tell me, what was he really saying? Because we know the tone. We've heard it in courtrooms, in traffic stops, in HR offices, in bank lines. It's not about time. It's about power. It's about the eternal question in this country. Who do you think you are? And Evelyn, God bless her. She didn't answer with a title. Not yet. She answered with silence, with restraint. Because for people like us, silence is not surrender. It is calculation. It is grace under fire. But I'll tell you this. That silence? It doesn't last forever. Because sometimes the gate becomes a battlefield. Not of violence, but of dignity. And when that moment comes, when silence must make way for truth, it doesn't just speak. It roars. When you are black in America, you begin your education long before you set foot in a classroom. It's not algebra they teach you first. It's how to keep your hands in plain sight. It's how to modulate your tone so your truth sounds palatable. It's how to smile without surrendering. Evelyn Daniels learned these lessons early. She was raised in a quiet suburb outside Chicago, where the streets were clean, the lawns trimmed, and the suspicion politely sharpened. The Daniels family, her father a schoolteacher, her mother a nurse, believed in hard work, education, and the quiet dignity of doing things right. But doing things right doesn't always keep you safe. Sometimes, it just makes your excellence harder to accept. As a girl, Evelyn was told, "You have to be twice as good to get half as far." And so she was. Valedictorian. Harvard Law. Fluent in the language of power, but fluent also in the unspoken dialect of resistance. Because even as she sat on panels, led negotiations, rewrote corporate policy, she never forgot the way a store clerk's eyes narrowed when she walked in with braids. Never forgot how a cab would bypass her hand for a paler one raised just seconds later. Never forgot that no amount of success could vaccinate her against the virus of suspicion. This is the contradiction America feeds us. It invites us to rise while digging moats around the towers. Now, back at the gate, Evelyn's encounter with Officer Bradley might have seemed isolated to some. A random check. A misunderstanding. But for those of us who've lived through repetition, it's never random, and it's rarely misunderstood. It's patterned. It's taught. It's passed down like a bitter heirloom from one generation of authority to the next. And on that morning, Evelyn could feel it, the next trial beginning. The gate was now a stage, and the audience was watching. A white man in a rumpled suit had missed his flight. He was angry, belligerent, raised his voice, pounded the counter, threatened the gate agent with lawsuits and bad reviews. Bradley approached him. But I did not touch him. No hand on the baton. No barked commands. Just a suggestion. Sir, please step aside. Politeness for one. Pressure for the other. Evelyn watched this unfold and felt the familiar sting of inequity. The sting of knowing that her calm would be read as calculated. Her poise mistaken for arrogance. Her silence as defiance. Now here's the thing. Racism today doesn't need slurs to survive. It breathes through implication. It thrives on the benefit of the doubt given to some and withheld from others. It says, "You don't belong here." Not with words, but with delay, with surveillance, with routine checks and random screenings. It says, "We're just following procedure," even when the procedure smells like a lie. And Officer Bradley, he was the sort of man who needed to believe his authority was unquestioned, not examined, not challenged. And here was Evelyn Daniels, who challenged him simply by existing unafraid. He saw her not as a woman trying to get to a meeting, but as a disruption. He didn't know her name, but he felt her presence as a threat, not because of anything she said, but because her very calmness refused to bend. This is the part older folks like you understand best. You've seen power panic when it's not worshipped. You've watched dignity be read as defiance. You've lived through moments when doing everything right still earned you suspicion. Evelyn was now caught in that loop. And the stakes were climbing. Every glance she gave was read as a challenge. Every movement she made was a potential incident. The officer didn't need a reason. He only needed a story he could sell. And the problem with being black at the gate is, they've already written the ending. They're just waiting for you to act it out. But Evelyn? She wasn't here to play their part. And when the next escalation came, and it was coming, she would be ready. Not just with words. Not just with credentials. But with truth. The trouble with America is not that it lies. The trouble is that it lies so well and so often that even its lies begin to believe themselves. And there, in the chilled light of Gate D8, Evelyn Daniels found herself walking into the theater of that lie. A theater where blackness is always the antagonist, where silence is mistaken for plotting, where presence is seen as presumption, And where the real crime, always, is being too calm, too collected, too composed in a place not designed for you to stand tall. You see, Officer Bradley didn't just notice Evelyn. He studied her. And like so many before him, men who wear uniforms like second skins and suspicion like oxygen, he began to imagine a story. A story in which he was the hero. And she, well, she was the question mark that needed answering. What was she doing alone? Why so poised? Why so certain? That's the thing about racism in its modern form. It's not in the slur, it's in the script. So he followed her. To the coffee kiosk. To the corner near the windows. Eyes locked on her every move. You've lived long enough to know what this is. It's the old Southern shadow in a northern suit. It's the patrol car creeping behind the kid just walking home. It's the store clerk who just wants to help. It's the TSA agent who needs a second look at your ID, but never quite explains why. Bradley didn't need a reason. He had authority. And in this country, authority can sometimes be the mask that cruelty wears to feel righteous. He stood in front of her again. Too close. Too quiet. Too full of power. Just doing my job, he said. But his eyes were hungry. Hungry not for justice, but for a reaction. Evelyn stared back. There was no rage in her. Not yet. But there was history. And history starred with her. The backs of her grandparents bent over sharecropper soil. The church bombings. The lunch counter standoffs. Her father's voice when he taught her, gently but firmly. You walk with pride, baby girl, but you watch your back. Now the pace began to quicken. The rhythm, once slow and subtle, became charged. Because that's how this country often plays its cards. First a suggestion. Then a warning. Then a threat. At first, he asked for her boarding pass. Then he questioned her travel time. Then came the shadow of a warning. You cause any problems, you'll have to answer me. And there it was. Not racism as spectacle, but racism as default. The quiet assumption that she was a problem waiting to happen. Let me tell you something. People over 65 remember a different kind of fire. You saw dogs set on marchers, hoses on children. But now? Now, it's the paperwork. It's the policies. It's the quiet interrogation of your right to be here. Now, unbothered. It's the sense that you must be up to something. Simply because you're not nervous. Evelyn didn't cower. She didn't explain herself. And that, more than anything, is what made her dangerous. The gate was still boarding. Announcements hummed overhead. Children laughed 2 seats away. But Evelyn could feel the room tilt. The storm was circling. And the next strike? It came not from her actions, but from someone else's mistake. A mother. 2 small children. A shoulder brushing against Officer Bradley by accident. He spun. Yelled. Loud enough to stop hearts. And Evelyn, still holding her latte, did the only thing her soul would let her do. She stepped between him and the mother. Not with force. Not with fury. But with presence. She's just trying to catch her flight with her children, she said. Voice low, calm, clear. That was enough. Enough to flip the switch. Bradley's hand flew to his belt. You're interfering with law enforcement, he barked. Turn around. Hands behind your back. And, just like that, the mask fell. The script he'd been writing all morning now had its climax. A black woman standing still, protecting a stranger. And now, in front of a crowd, being arrested. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that his script wasn't the only one being written that morning. Because Evelyn Daniels had hers too. And it was about to turn the entire gate into a courtroom. The thing about being black in America is that you learn early. Very early. That truth isn't always enough. That you can be right and still be wrong. In the eyes of the wrong man. And on that morning at Gate D8, with cold steel kissing her wrist, and 100 stares pressed like floodlights on her skin, Evelyn Daniels stood at the edge of that terrible truth. This, after all, wasn't about justice. It never really had been. It was about performance. Officer Bradley had set his stage. The lights were up. The cameras were rolling, phones out, held high by strangers. Too stunned to shout, but too familiar with the script to look away. He had what he wanted. A scene. A suspect. A crowd. But he forgot, or perhaps never imagined, that Evelyn was not just a woman with grace in her spine. She was a woman with power in her name. Let go of me. Her voice cracked across the gate like a thunderclap. I am Evelyn Daniels, General Counsel for Delta Airlines. And you, officer, have just made a very big mistake. The world still. You could hear the engine hum of an idle aircraft in the background. The breathing of onlookers held tight in their throats. The sound of authority. Crumbling. Now let me pause here. If you're over 65, you remember when truth had to shout to be heard. When a black man's name meant little more than a footnote, unless he sang, dribbled, or marched with a sign. But this moment, this very moment, was different. Because Evelyn's truth came not as plea, not as protest, but as a declaration. It didn't ask to be believed. It demanded to be reckoned with. Bradley's face shifted. You could see it. The collapse of certainty. The sudden weight of consequence. He froze, hand still on the cuff. The tremble in his fingers betraying what centuries of power had allowed him to ignore. That black women can hold more than pain. Sometimes they hold the keys. And the lie, the one this country keeps writing, began to tear at the seams. A pilot stepped forward. His voice was firm. Miss Daniels, are you all right? Captain Jonathan Pierce. White. In uniform. And clearly aware that this was not just a PR nightmare. This was a reckoning. Evelyn stood tall. One wrist still half-cuffed. Her voice is calm, clear. This officer followed me. He harassed me. He tried to arrest me for speaking up. And he did so without cause. Without reason. And perhaps worst of all, without shame. People started to murmur. First in whispers. Then louder. She didn't do anything. I saw the whole thing. She was helping that woman with kids. The crowd, once silent, found its voice. Because injustice needs silence to breathe. And silence, that morning, was dying fast. A man in a suit appeared, terminal operations. His tie crooked, his face pale. Miss Daniels, please, let's move this to a private room. But Evelyn? She had no interest in back rooms. No interest in whispered apologies or quiet damage control. No. She said it was like law. I'm not going anywhere. And I'm not staying silent. Not now. Not again. Here lies the contradiction so many older Black Americans know in their bones. We are told to rise. And when we rise, we are told to stay quiet. To not embarrass them. To not make a scene. To handle it with grace. But what is grace without truth? What is dignity if it is never defended? Evelyn Daniels wasn't simply defending herself. She was undoing something. Undoing the belief that Black women must smile through surveillance. That title is not enough. That power must always be performed gently, so as not to offend those who wish you had none at all. And as she stood there, badge in one hand, wrist swollen from the pressure of a reckless hand, she was not just Evelyn. She was every woman who had been told to sit down. Every voice ever silenced in the name of order. And that morning, she was louder than all of them combined. Power never surrenders politely. It does not hand over its crown. It claws, it resists, it casts doubt on your very right to speak. And that morning, at Gate D8, as Evelyn Daniels stood uncuffed but unshaken, the air was thick with the scent of reckoning. Not the kind in law books or courtroom verdicts. No. This was the kind that happens when the truth refuses to back down. When dignity stands in daylight and says, "Look at me. I am still here." Officer Bradley, once the self-appointed conductor of this humiliating symphony, now stood exposed. his script unraveling. He tried to speak, tried to reclaim the narrative. She was interfering, he muttered. She escalated. But the phones were still recording. The crowd had seen. And worse, for him, they believed her. Because what they witnessed was not escalation. It was emancipation. The kind that doesn't ask permission. And yet, if you've lived through enough decades in America, you know this moment well. The moment after the veil is lifted. But before the system dares to admit it has sinned. This is the liminal space, where apologies are whispered, but accountability is delayed, where management says we'll look into it, while still hoping you'll forget. But Evelyn had no intention of forgetting. The man in the crooked tie, Neil, from Terminal Ops, offered her a private room again. She declined again. "I'm not a disturbance," she said. "I'm a witness." And all around her, passengers, once strangers, nodded, murmured, raised their voices. She helped that mother. She didn't do anything. She was calm the whole time. You see, the beautiful thing about truth is that it spreads, even when the system is built to contain it. Especially then. Still, the struggle was far from over. Because racism, my friends, is persistent. It is not embarrassed by cameras. It does not retire when exposed. It adapts. And so, Officer Bradley didn't leave, not yet. He lingered, hovering like a wasp in a room full of breathless people. His jaw clenched, his eyes scanning the crowd, searching for a crack in the wall of support around Evelyn. But no cracks came. Not this time. Now, here's what you must understand. This was not just about Evelyn Daniels. It was about what happens when someone finally says no. Not in anger, but with authority. And the system doesn't know what to do with that. It's used to protest in the streets. It's used for hashtags and petitions. But this? This was different. This was corporate power wielded by a black woman. With nothing to prove. And everything to protect. Then came a voice from the back. Soft, but firm. "Miss Daniels," it said. "We've had concerns about this officer before. I'm sorry it had to reach this point." It was Gerald Atkins, a TSA supervisor. Black. Gray at the temples. The kind of man who'd survived more indignities than he'd ever had time to name. And just like that, the unspoken became spoken. There had been warnings. There had been complaints. There had been silence. And now the silence was broken. That's the deepest contradiction of all, isn't it? That systems meant to protect us often protect themselves first. That misconduct isn't punished until it becomes unavoidable. That abuse is tolerated until it's caught on tape. That black dignity is negotiable until someone powerful enough refuses to negotiate. And that day, Evelyn Daniels had no intention of negotiating her worth. She turned to Neil. "Escort Officer Bradley from this gate," she said. "And prepare to hear from my office. Delta Legal will be in contact with both the Port Authority and the Airline Board before this day is done." There was no tremble in her voice. No performance. Just fact. The kind of fact you can't distort with a badge. The kind that doesn't need permission to exist. And so, the officer, once certain of his place in the hierarchy, was walked out. His posture sagging under the weight of a mistake that could no longer be rewritten. Phones followed him. But so did whispers of justice. Soft and rising like a hymn. A woman had stood still, and the world had finally moved. The truth, once spoken, does not simply vanish. It echoes. It ripples outward, disturbing the still waters where silence once floated like civility. That morning, as Evelyn Daniels stepped past the gate, her wrists still sore, her dignity intact, the incident had already outgrown its origin. The gate was no longer a gate. It was a witness stand. It was a pulpit. It was a lens. And in the age we live in, where justice too often hides in the margins, a single voice, recorded, shared, witnessed, can cut through walls built by centuries. But let us not be fooled. This was no fairy tale. This was not a bad apple. It was a system flexing, faltering, and finally being seen. On the plane to Atlanta, Evelyn did not rest. How could she? Her phone vibrated with every breath. Legal briefings, media requests, executives wanting statements, colleagues whispering about optics, PR teams calculating risk. But optics cannot save you when the soul of your company is on trial. And Evelyn knew that. She wasn't a passenger anymore. She had become a vessel. Not because she sought it, but because the country, as it always does, chose to remind her of her place. And she chose not to accept it. Now listen closely. You, the elder. You who saw the dogs in Birmingham and the bridges in Selma. You know this moment too. It is the after. The slow storm. The moment after the fire. When people begin to calculate what the flames might cost them. Evelyn entered the Delta Executive Lounge in Atlanta to muted nods, tight smiles, and the smell of fear disguised as professionalism. Miss Daniels, we support you, of course. But what do you want to do next? What she wanted was not revenge, not a headline. What she wanted was reckoning. And reckoning, my friend, is never comfortable. She sat across from lawyers and vice presidents who looked suddenly smaller. Not because she had grown taller, but because the truth had stripped away their excuses. We'll draft a statement, they said. Reaffirm our commitment to diversity. We'll use the word unfortunate, maybe isolated. Evelyn raised her hand. No. She didn't shout. She cut. Don't write this like a bump in the road. Write it like a mirror. Because that's what this country avoids most. Seeing itself clearly, honestly, without makeup or denial. And then the real trial began. Not in court, but in living rooms, in comment sections, in boardrooms filled with white discomfort and black exhaustion. The footage spread. Not because it was shocking, but because it was familiar. Older black men saw their sons in Evelyn's stillness. Mothers saw their daughters. White viewers clutched at their pearls of surely not. But Evelyn's calm was indictment enough. And what of Officer Bradley? He was suspended, then investigated. His history unspooled like a string soaked in gasoline. Other complaints emerged, quiet ones, buried in reports, ignored like background noise. And that, too, is the American way, isn't it? To notice only when forced. To respond only when recorded. Bradley's downfall was not just his behavior. It was his visibility. Had Evelyn been anyone else, his power might have gone unchallenged. But now, the story had teeth. Still, Evelyn felt no triumph. Because the questions remained. How many weren't recorded? How many voices were silenced not by law, but by fatigue? How many lived a quieter version of this, every day, just without the spotlight? Victory, if we can call it that, is no salve for the rot at the root. And Evelyn understood that. She didn't want applause. She wanted prevention. A change not just in policy, but in culture. Not just a fired cop, but a refused norm. And so she began again. Not with lawsuits, though those would come, but with language, with memos, with policy reviews, with conversations too long delayed. She met with TSA supervisors, Delta's HR, Port Authority Legal. She drafted protocols. She insisted on trauma support for passengers and staff. She demanded that gate agents be empowered to report harassment without fear. She turned her pain into a blueprint. Because Evelyn Daniels, like so many before her, knew the cruelest part of injustice is not the blow, it's the silence after. And she would not let silence settle. There is a particular weight that lives in rooms where history has been ignored. It hums. It presses against the walls like breath withheld. And when a black woman enters that kind of room, the air itself tenses. Because whether they admit it or not, those seated at the table already know. They're about to be held accountable. Evelyn Daniels stood at the head of the conference table, on the 30th floor of Delta's Atlanta headquarters, not as a victim, not as a figurehead, but as a force. Across from her sat men in gray suits, women in tailored power blouses, all seasoned in the language of corporate safety, public image, brand reputation, containment. And yet, no one dared to contain her now. She did not raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her presence alone, black, brilliant, and unapologetically unmoved, was enough to make their own words tremble. "There will be change," she said. "Or there will be exposure. Choose." That's the thing older folks understand better than most. When you've lived through decades of waiting for permission, there comes a point when you stop asking. And Evelyn had reached it. But here is the deeper tension, the one we do not say aloud. Even now, in rooms of so-called progress, Black truth is still treated like a threat. They nod at your story, but flinch at your solutions. They quote Martin Luther King, but fear your Martin Luther truth, because fixing the problem would mean admitting the wound was real, and they helped cause it. As the meeting went on, proposals were passed around. Revised training, diversity liaisons, employee support networks. All good, all necessary, all inadequate, because Evelyn knew the system did not fail by accident. It functioned as designed. The goal now was not decoration. It was deconstruction. Later that day, she returned to her office. The city glowed outside her window, but her heart was heavy, not with defeat, but with clarity. Because the hardest part of confronting racism in the modern age is not the insult. It is the performance that follows. The emails, the soft apologies, the promises to do better. From people who never thought they were part of the problem. It's the suggestion that what happened was unfortunate, not systemic. And Evelyn, tired but still standing, knew what came next. She began drafting what would become the cornerstone of Delta's new internal code on law enforcement interaction, anti-bias training, and passenger advocacy. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. But it was undeniable. Because the best way to honor justice is not to pose beside it. It is to institutionalize it. Still, in the background, the world whispered. Media requests poured in. Think pieces. Talk shows. Some hailed her a hero. Some questioned her motives. Some said she overreacted, as if defending dignity was now considered drama. But here's what you know, what all of us who've had to prove our humanity again and again know. They are only comfortable with your strength when it stays silent. One evening, as she prepared for another strategy call, an email arrived. It was from Marisol Torres, the mother Evelyn had defended at the gate. Her words were simple. "I don't know who you are exactly, but I know what you did saved my children from something I couldn't name. Thank you. You didn't just protect me. You showed them what standing looks like." Evelyn sat back, and for the first time in days, she wept. Not for herself, but for the unseen cost of always having to hold the line. Because to be Black and powerful in this country means learning to wield grace like armor and fire like language. It is a terrible thing to live in a nation that asks you, again and again, to prove that your pain is real, that your memory is accurate, that your dignity is worth defending. And so Evelyn Daniels, a woman carved by discipline and sharpened by silence, walked into the reckoning room, not for herself, but for those who had never been offered a seat there. The Port Authority hearing was held in a narrow chamber draped in bureaucracy. A table, a panel of faces, some stern, some performative. Badges, binders, and the air of procedural performance. Officer Bradley sat at one end. Jaw clenched, eyes hollow. Not angry, just unraveling. Because he had built his confidence not on truth, but on the assumed safety of impunity. And that, finally, was gone. Evelyn did not come to gloat. She came to testify. And let me tell you something you already know. Especially if you've lived through the long bruised chapters of this country. Telling the truth, when the room is designed to suppress it, is a radical act. But Evelyn had no tremble in her tone. She spoke not of what was imagined, but of what was recorded. She gave them not emotion, but evidence. And still, they squirmed. Because the greater threat to systems of power is not the loud protester outside the building. It is the quiet executive who understands the system from the inside and still chooses to dismantle it. Bradley's defense was weak. He invoked procedure, gut instinct, maintaining public safety, but every word folded in on itself. Not because Evelyn shouted him down. She never had to. She simply refused to shrink. That, my friend, is what undoes the lie. Not rage. Not retaliation. Presence. The panel asked questions. Some meaningful, some mechanical. But the most telling moment came not from a question, but from a silence. A long, loaded pause. After Evelyn asked her question. And if I hadn't had this badge, this title, what exactly would have happened to me? No one answered. Because they all already knew. Now, for those of you who remember the marches, the hoses, the hard-won legislation, you also remember what comes next. After the hearing, after the apology, after the headlines, the forgetting. But Evelyn was determined that this would not be another scar buried beneath a blazer. She returned to Delta not to resume, but to reshape. A month after the incident, the first iteration of Delta's passenger equity protocol went live. It wasn't perfect, but it was a precedent. For the first time, an airline had formally outlined the rights of passengers. In the face of law enforcement overreach, for the first time, Black passengers didn't have to rely on luck or status to feel safe in the boarding line. Evelyn pushed for it, fought for it, not because she was angry, but because she refused to let the system survive another polite cover-up. Bradley was dismissed, not just for this incident, but for the pattern. The pattern America always claims it cannot see, until it is printed in reports, shown on video, recounted by the right kind of witness. And then, only then, does it act. As the seasons turned, Evelyn received letters from employees, passengers, strangers. One from a young Black flight attendant read, "You didn't just protect your name. You protected mine before I had a chance to make it." Another from a white Vietnam veteran said, "I'm 74, and I saw what happened. Don't let anyone tell you we can't change. We just need to be forced to face it. And that's the truth, isn't it? This country does not change because it's ready. It changes because someone demands to be seen, refuses to be small, refuses to be safe." And Evelyn Daniels, on that day at Gate D8, became more than an executive. She became an interruption, a beautifully inconvenient one. And God knows this country has needed 1,000 more. So no, this story is not about a cop and a boarding pass. It is about the lie that Black people must stay silent in exchange for survival. And what happens when one woman decides that survival is no longer enough?